The 47th floor of a downtown skyscraper, where the morning sun streams through floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the pristine white walls and modern artwork that probably costs more than my yearly salary. This is where I work as a project manager and where I had a front row seat to one of the most satisfying reality checks I've ever witnessed. Let me introduce you to our main characters. First, we have Michael, our recently hired Senior Vice President of Sales. You know the type: designer suits, luxury watch collection, and that practiced smile that never quite reaches his eyes. He's the kind of executive who drops Harvard Business School into every conversation and treats the elevator like his personal TE talk stage. Then there's David, our marketing director. This guy is the real deal: brilliant strategist, innovative thinker, and someone who's been consistently driving results for the company for the past 5 years. David's got this quiet confidence about him, the kind that comes from actually knowing what you're doing rather than just talking about it. From day one, it was clear that Michael had let's call it an issue, with David's growing influence in the company. Every time David presented his marketing strategies in meetings, Michael would interrupt with, well, actually statements or try to poke holes in perfectly sound proposals. The thing is, David's track record spoke for itself. His campaigns had increased our market share by 35% in just 2 years. But Michael, he wasn't having it. He started scheduling competing meetings during David's presentations, accidentally leaving David off important email threads, and even took credit for one of David's innovative customer retention strategies during a board meeting. Yeah, it was that bad. The tension kept building, like watching a pressure cooker about to blow. And then came the annual client conference, our company's biggest event of the year. Michael had been bragging for weeks about this revolutionary sales strategy he was going to present. He made sure everyone knew he'd been working late nights and weekends on it, sending emails at 2 a.m. just so people would see the timestamp. David, meanwhile, had been quietly preparing his own presentation about the success of our latest digital marketing campaign. No fanfare, no self-promotion, just solid data and results. The day of the conference arrived, and the grand ballroom was packed with our biggest clients, industry partners, and even a few competitors who'd managed to snag tickets. The air was thick with anticipation, especially since Michael had somehow managed to get his presentation scheduled right before David's. Michael strutted onto the stage like he owned it, looking like he'd just stepped out of a business magazine photo shoot. He fired up his PowerPoint, cleared his throat, and began what he promised would be the most innovative sales approach of the decade. But here's where things get interesting. As Michael clicked through his first few slides, I noticed something familiar about his strategy. Very familiar. In fact, it looked exactly like, well, I don't want to spoil what happens next. Let's just say that what unfolded in the next 30 minutes had the entire audience shifting uncomfortably in their seats and taught everyone present a valuable lesson about authenticity, respect, and the true meaning of professional integrity. Want to know what happened next? How did David react? And more importantly, what made our CEO stand up in the middle of the presentation? Stay tuned for part 2 of this story, where everything comes to a head in the most unexpected way. Trust me, you won't want to miss how karma finally catches up to our friend Michael. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to catch the next part of this wild workplace story. Drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with someone like Michael. I bet we've all got some stories to share. Welcome back. Before I tell you what happened next at that conference, let me give you some backstory that makes this whole situation even more intense. See, 6 months before Michael joined our company, David had actually pitched a revolutionary sales integration system to our executive board. It was this brilliant blend of AI-powered analytics and personalized customer outreach, the kind of innovation that could transform an entire industry. The board loved it, but they decided to put it on hold until the next fiscal year due to budget constraints. David, being the professional he is, simply nodded and continued refining his proposal in his spare time. He never complained, never made a fuss, just kept doing his job with excellence. Enter Michael, fresh from his previous position at our competitor, where he'd apparently set some kind of sales record. Though, funny thing about that, Nobody could ever find any public information about these supposedly legendary achievements. But he had that smooth talk, that polished presence that somehow convinced our higher-ups he was exactly what the company needed. I remember this one meeting about 2 weeks after Michael started. We were discussing quarterly targets, and David presented some impressive growth figures from his latest campaign. Michael's response, he actually yawned. Yes, literally yawned, and started scrolling through his phone. The room got so quiet you could hear Karen from accounting dropping her paperclips 2 floors down. But here's where it gets really interesting. A week before the conference, I was working late. You know how those quarterly reports can be, and I saw Michael sneaking into David's office. Now, David always kept his door open, said it promoted transparency. But that night after Michael left, I noticed he'd been accessing David's computer. I mentioned it to David the next day, but he just gave me that knowing smile of his. Sometimes, he said, you have to let people reveal their true character on their own. I didn't understand what he meant then, but standing in that conference room, watching Michael's presentation unfold, it all started making sense. Back to that conference room moment. Michael was about halfway through his presentation, clicking through slides that looked suspiciously familiar. The graphics were different, sure, and he'd changed some of the terminology, but anyone who'd been in that board meeting 6 months ago would recognize the core strategy. It was David's work, barely disguised with fancy new charts and buzzwords. I glanced over at David, expecting to see anger or at least frustration. Instead, he sat there calmly, taking notes on his iPad, occasionally nodding as if he was listening to any other presentation. But there was something else, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, and he kept checking his watch as if he was waiting for something. Our CEO, Mrs. Thompson, was known for her poker face. 20 years of corporate leadership will do that to you. But even she was starting to look uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and whispering to her assistant. The tension in the room was building like a pressure cooker about to blow. And then it happened. Just as Michael reached what he called his groundbreaking conclusion, Mrs. Thompson stood up. The look on her face. Well, I've only seen that expression once before, and it was when someone tried to embezzle company funds during her first year as CEO. But before I tell you what she said, and how David managed to turn this whole situation around, I need to explain about the secret meeting that happened the night before, because what happened next wasn't just about exposing a fraud. It was about teaching a lesson that none of us would ever forget. Stay tuned for the next part of this story, where everything comes together in the most unexpected way. Trust me, what happened next changed our entire company culture forever. Let me tell you about that secret meeting I mentioned. The night before the conference, while most of us were heading home, I noticed David walking into Mrs. Thompson's office. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but something was different this time. He was carrying a thick blue folder, the kind we use for internal investigations. Earlier that week, our department had been unusually busy. They'd been pulling late nights, running system audits, and checking access logs. At the time, we all assumed it was routine maintenance, but in hindsight, the pieces were starting to fit together like a perfectly planned puzzle. Back in the conference room, Mrs. Thompson was still standing, her expression a mix of disappointment and, was that a hint of satisfaction? The room had gone so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Michael had stopped mid-sentence, his confident smile faltering for the first time since he'd started working here. "Please continue, Michael," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice carrying that particular tone that makes everyone sit up straighter. "I'm especially interested in hearing about where you developed this innovative strategy." She emphasized the word developed in a way that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Michael's forehead started to glisten under the presentation lights. He loosened his designer tie slightly, that same tie he bragged about costing more than our monthly coffee budget. "Well, as I was saying," he stuttered, clicking to the next slide, "this revolutionary approach came to me during my extensive experience in—" That's when David raised his hand, not in an aggressive way, but with the calm confidence of someone holding all the cards in a high-stakes poker game. Mrs. Thompson nodded at him, and he stood up, iPad in hand. "Michael," David said, his voice steady and professional. "Would you mind explaining the implementation timeline on slide 27? I'm particularly interested in the data from last quarter's beta test." The color drained from Michael's face faster than our office printer runs out of ink on deadline day. You see, there hadn't been any beta test, because this wasn't his strategy to test. The numbers he presented were theoretical projections from David's original proposal, the one that had been waiting for next year's budget. But here's where it gets even more interesting. As Michael fumbled for an answer, our head of it quietly slipped into the room, laptop in hand. She gave Mrs. Thompson a subtle nod, and I swear I saw our CEO's lips twitch into the smallest smile. The tension in the room was electric. Every person there knew they were witnessing something significant, even if they didn't know exactly what was about to unfold. The investors in the front row were leaning forward in their seats, and I noticed several board members exchanging knowing glances. Michael must have sensed the walls closing in because he tried one last desperate move. "Actually," he said, straightening his jacket, "I'd love to address that question, but first, I think we should look at the remarkable results from my previous company." He reached for his phone, probably to pull up some hastily fabricated numbers. That's when Mrs. Thompson held up her hand. "Before you continue, Michael, I believe our IT department has something relevant to share about your recent research methods." She gestured to the tech team, who were setting up a second projector. The look on Michael's face, it was like watching someone realize they'd walked into their own carefully laid trap. But what happened next left everyone in that room speechless. The evidence our IT team was about to present would reshape not just this presentation, but the entire dynamic of our corporate culture. Want to know what was in that second presentation, and more importantly, why David had spent the last month letting this all play out? Trust me, the next part of this story shows exactly why karma always keeps receipts. Stay tuned. You won't want to miss how this all comes together. As our IT director connected her laptop to the projector, something unexpected happened. Michael's phone started buzzing. Not just a single notification, but a constant stream of alerts. The timing couldn't have been worse, but that's the thing about karma. It doesn't wait for convenient moments. The second screen flickered to life, displaying a series of security camera footage timestamps. But before our IT director could begin her presentation, Michael's face suddenly lit up with an almost manic confidence. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, before we continue, I have something I need to share with everyone." The room collectively held its breath. This was not part of the plan. You could see it in Mrs. Thompson's slightly raised eyebrow and David's intensified focus. Michael pulled out his phone, holding it up like he had just been handed a trump card. "I just received confirmation," he announced, his voice dripping with attempted authority, "that our biggest competitor, Turner and Associates, is willing to implement my strategy immediately. In fact," he paused for dramatic effect, "they're offering to double my current salary and fast-track the implementation. So perhaps we should discuss the value of innovation and recognition before moving forward with whatever this is." A few gasps echoed through the conference room. Was he really trying to blackmail the company in front of our biggest clients and partners? Bold move, or desperate one, depending on how you looked at it. But here's where it gets interesting. David actually chuckled. Not a mocking laugh, but the kind of gentle amusement you show when a child thinks they've outsmarted you by hiding vegetables under their napkin. Mrs. Thompson's response was equally unexpected. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying that dangerous calm that experienced executives know all too well, "would you mind checking the sender of those messages again?" The confusion on Michael's face was priceless as he looked down at his phone. His confident smirk melted faster than an ice cube in August. "You see, those messages weren't from Turner and Associates at all. They were from our IT department's security system, automatically notifying him of every unauthorized access he'd made to David's computer over the past month. Every file he'd copied, every folder he'd opened, all logged and time-stamped. But wait, it gets better. The security footage now playing on the second screen showed something even more damning. Split-screen recordings of Michael entering the office at odd hours, alongside screen captures of his computer activity. On the left, Michael sneaking into David's office at 2 a.m. On the right, files being copied and emailed to an external address. David stood up again, this time holding what appeared to be a sealed envelope. "Before you consider taking my strategy to our competitors," he said calmly, "you might want to know about the pending patent application I filed 6 months ago, the one that's being announced." He checked his watch with theatrical precision. Right about now. On cue, phones around the room started buzzing, but this time with a real press release. Our company had just been granted a groundbreaking patent for an innovative sales integration system, the very system Michael had been presenting as his own. The room erupted in murmurs. Investors were whispering frantically, board members were exchanging significant looks, and our competitors in the audience were frantically taking notes. But that wasn't even the biggest bombshell about to drop. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, holding up another folder, a red one this time. "Now," she said, "shall we discuss the non-compete clause in your contract, Michael? The one that specifically mentions Turner and Associates." Her smile was polite, but her eyes held the kind of authority that could freeze lava. "Or perhaps we should talk about the real reason you left your last position." The atmosphere in the room shifted again. We all thought we knew where the story was going, but that red folder promised something none of us had seen coming. Even David looked surprised, and that's when I realized this went deeper than any of us had imagined. Want to know what was in that red folder, and why David's patent application was just the tip of the iceberg? Stay tuned for the final part of this story, where all the pieces come together in a way that none of us saw coming. Mrs. Thompson opened the red folder with deliberate slowness, every eye in the room fixed on her movements. "Michael," she began, "did you ever wonder why we hired you, despite your somewhat questionable references?" The look of confusion on his face said it all. She pulled out a document, an email thread printed on our competitor's letterhead. "You see, 3 months ago, Turner and Associates reached out to us. It seems they had experienced a similar situation with a certain executive who had stolen proprietary information before suddenly departing. They were kind enough to warn us, but instead of simply rejecting your application, we saw an opportunity." David stepped forward, taking over the narrative. "We knew our patent application would take months to process," he explained. "During that time, we needed to identify any potential security breaches in our system. What better way than to let someone with a proven track record test our defenses?" The realization hit Michael like a ton of bricks. His face went through a rainbow of emotions: confusion, anger, disbelief, and finally, defeat. He had never been the hunter. He had been the bait all along. Every unauthorized access, every stolen file, every late-night office visit, our director chimed in, pulling up a detailed log on the screen, was monitored, documented, and added to our security audit. "Thanks to you, we've identified and patched 17 potential vulnerabilities in our system. But here's where it gets really interesting." Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. She pulled out another document from the folder. "However, Michael, your most valuable contribution wasn't exposing our security flaws. It was helping us identify something far more concerning." The room went dead quiet. Even David looked puzzled. This wasn't part of what he knew about the plan. "While tracking your activities," Mrs. Thompson continued, "we uncovered evidence of a coordinated corporate espionage attempt targeting not just us, but every major company in our industry. The FBI's Corporate Fraud Division has been particularly interested in these findings." Right on cue, 2 individuals who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room stood up, badges in hand. Turned out our little corporate drama was just one part of a much larger investigation. Michael sank into his chair, his designer suit suddenly looking like it was weighing him down. But before the agents could step forward, David raised his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, if I may." She nodded, and David turned to face Michael. "The strategy you presented today," David said, his voice carrying no trace of malice. "It wasn't just about sales integration. It was a honeypot, filled with carefully crafted misinformation. The real system, the one we're implementing next quarter, is something entirely different." He turned to our clients and partners in the audience. "And that's what I'll be presenting next." The room erupted in applause. Not the polite, corporate kind, but genuine appreciation for what they just witnessed. Michael was quietly escorted out by the federal agents, and Mrs. Thompson called for a brief break before David's presentation. As people filed out for coffee, I caught up with David near the water cooler. "Did you know," I asked, "about the federal investigation?" He smiled that knowing smile of his. Let's just say that sometimes the best way to catch someone stealing your spotlight is to make it bright enough to illuminate everything else they've been hiding. Mrs. Thompson walked past us, pausing briefly. "Excellent work, David," she said. "By the way, the board meeting tomorrow morning. We'll be discussing a few changes to the executive team. I trust you'll have some fresh ideas for the position of senior vice president." David's genuine look of surprise. Now that was priceless. Sometimes the best victories aren't the ones you plan, but the ones you earn through integrity and patience. As for Michael, well, let's just say he's got a new office now, with much sturdier security and far less access to computers. But the real lesson here isn't about karma or justice. It's about something my grandmother used to say: the truth doesn't need spotlight. It shines all by itself. And that, my friends, is how a failed attempt to steal someone's thunder ended up clearing the air for everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more corporate stories. Trust me, after this incident, I've got plenty more to share. You might be wondering what happened after all that drama died down. Well, let me fill you in on some pretty interesting developments that followed. The day after the conference, our office was buzzing with energy like never before. People who usually kept to themselves were chatting by the coffee machine, sharing their favorite moments from what everyone now called the presentation. David's actual presentation, by the way, was absolutely brilliant. His real sales integration system wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. Within the first quarter of implementation, our client retention rate shot up by 45%, and we started getting calls from companies we've been trying to work with for years. But here's what really changed: the office culture. Remember those late-night emails people used to send just to show they were working? Gone. The competitive one-upmanship in meetings disappeared. Instead, people started collaborating more, sharing credit for successes, and actually helping each other grow. Turns out, watching someone try to steal the spotlight and fail spectacularly makes you appreciate the value of genuine teamwork. Mrs. Thompson followed through on her hint about the executive position, but David did something unexpected during that board meeting. He proposed splitting the role into two positions: strategy development and team innovation. His reasoning: no one person should have all the spotlight. Success is a team sport. They approved it unanimously. As for our department, they became office celebrities. People started bringing them coffee and actually reading their security updates. Who knew it would take a corporate espionage plot to get people to care about password security? The federal investigation revealed something even bigger. Michael had been part of a network of corporate spies targeting tech companies across the country. Our little sting operation helped uncover millions in stolen intellectual property. Turner and Associates sent us a thank you basket. Turns out they'd been building a case against him too, but couldn't prove anything until now. But my favorite part of this whole story: last week, I saw a junior associate nervously approach David with an idea for improving our customer feedback system. Instead of brushing her off or taking credit for it, David invited her to develop the proposal together. They're presenting it to the board next month. You see, the real victory wasn't just exposing a fraudster or preventing corporate espionage. It was showing that real success doesn't come from trying to outshine others. It comes from lifting each other up and letting authentic talent speak for itself. These days, when new employees join our company, they get told this story during orientation, not as a warning, but as a reminder that integrity and patience are worth more than any quick win or stolen glory. Oh, and that patent David filed? It's now being used as a case study in business schools, not for the technology, though that's impressive too, but for how to handle corporate ethics and leadership with grace under pressure. Before I wrap up this story, let me share one last detail that still makes me smile. Remember Michael's fancy corner office? It's been converted into a collaborative space where teams can work together on projects. The nameplate on the door now reads, the Spotlight Room, where we shine together. Thanks for sticking around for this wild ride of a story. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this, it's that true success isn't about outshining others. It's about creating enough light for everyone to shine. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you want more stories about corporate life, leadership lessons, and yes, the occasional serving of perfectly timed karma. Drop a comment below sharing your own workplace stories. I'd love to hear them. Until next time, remember, the brightest spotlight is the one we create together.